The citation arrived taped to my front door at 9:47 that same morning, less than an hour after I'd started cutting down a storm-damaged oak limb that had been threatening to fall on my own roof for weeks, describing my chainsaw use as a violation of the community's noise ordinance restricting power equipment operation before noon on weekdays. A rule I knew existed, and a rule I had, in fact, specifically confirmed did not apply to my situation before I ever pulled that chainsaw's cord. My name is Faruk Enkemeluich. I run a small licensed tree service, Heartwood Arbor Care, that I've operated for 11 years, and I want to establish clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that follows, that our state's specific noise ordinance framework, which our HOA's own governing declaration explicitly references and defers to for its power equipment restrictions, includes a standard, well-established exemption for licensed tree removal and arborist work addressing hazardous conditions. An exemption that exists precisely because storm damage, disease, and structural hazards involving trees often require prompt attention regardless of ordinary landscaping noise restrictions. Given the genuine safety risk, a compromised tree limb can pose the longer it's left unaddressed. I want to walk you through the specific situation that morning, because the urgency was genuine and well documented. A significant storm 2 days earlier had cracked a large limb on the mature oak in my backyard, leaving it hanging precariously, held up by little more than splintered bark, directly over a section of my own roof. I had already contacted my insurance company, who advised prompt removal given the clear ongoing risk, and I had scheduled the work for that morning specifically because an approaching weather system, forecast to bring significant wind later that same day, made delay considerably more dangerous than proceeding with the removal as early as reasonably possible. I want to tell you about the woman who issued the citation, a board president named Priscilla Wentworth Ashcombe, who had served in that role for about a year and a half at that point. I want to walk you through the conversation I had with her directly after finding that citation taped to my door, because I explained, calmly and specifically, exactly why my work that morning fell under the established hazardous tree exemption, citing both my professional arborist licensing and the documented, insurance-flagged safety risk the damaged limb posed. Priscilla's response, delivered with a confidence that struck me as genuinely puzzling given how specific and verifiable the underlying exemption actually was that she was not familiar with any such exemption in our community's noise policy, and that regardless of my professional licensing or the circumstances, the citation would stand as issued unless I could point her to the specific language authorizing an exception. I want to sit with that response for a moment, because it revealed something I found genuinely surprising given how straightforward this should have been to resolve. Our HOA's own governing declaration, in the exact section addressing power equipment noise restrictions, included an explicit cross-reference to our state and county's broader noise ordinance framework, stating that the community's own restrictions operated in accordance with and subject to all applicable municipal and state noise regulations and their established exemptions, language that, by its own plain terms, incorporated the hazardous tree removal exemption directly into our community's own rules, whether or not Priscilla herself happened to be personally familiar with it. I want to walk you through the research I did that same afternoon, because I wanted to make absolutely certain I was correctly interpreting both the county ordinance and how our own declaration incorporated it, before pursuing any formal dispute. I pulled the actual county noise ordinance text, confirming the exemption's exact language, which explicitly exempted licensed arborists and tree service professionals performing hazard mitigation work on damaged, diseased, or structurally compromised trees from standard time-of-day power equipment restrictions, a description that matched my own situation precisely: licensed professional, documented hazard. Work performed specifically to address that hazard rather than routine landscaping maintenance. I want to introduce you to my own attorney, a longtime family friend named Rosalind Ake Ferreira, who had helped me with various business matters over the years running Heartwood Arbor Care, and who I called that same evening, mostly expecting her to confirm what I already believed, that this citation had no real legal basis and would likely resolve itself once Priscilla actually reviewed the relevant ordinance language properly. I want to tell you about the conversation that followed, because Rosalind, once I described the situation in full, told me something that shifted my understanding of what I might actually be dealing with. "Farrokh," she said, "I want you to understand something before you simply send her the ordinance citation and expect this to resolve itself quietly. I've heard, secondhand through a mutual client, that this same HOA president has a pattern of issuing citations first and only reconsidering them if a resident pushes back hard enough to make the dispute genuinely inconvenient for her to maintain. I think you should document this formally, in writing, and I think, given your specific professional standing as a licensed arborist, this might actually be worth pursuing as more than just a single citation dispute, because if she's citing licensed tree professionals for exempted hazard work, I'd be curious whether this is the first time that's happened in this community. That question, whether other licensed tree professionals or homeowners performing genuinely exempted hazardous tree work had faced similar improper citations under Priscilla's enforcement, is where Part 2 picks up, because what Rosalind and I discovered over the following weeks, reaching out to several other tree service companies that regularly worked within our HOA's boundaries, revealed a pattern of exactly this kind of improper citation that extended considerably beyond my own single morning's dispute, and ultimately exposed something about how Priscilla had been enforcing noise restrictions that would end up costing her considerably more than a single overturned $200 fine. Rosalind and I began reaching out to other tree service companies that regularly performed hazard removal work within our HOA's boundaries, and what we found, over the following 2 weeks, revealed a pattern considerably broader than my own single citation. 3 other licensed arborists, each working on separate, unrelated hazardous tree situations for different Thornfield Hollow homeowners over the preceding year, described receiving nearly identical citations from Priscilla's board, every single one disregarding the same established exemption, every single one resolved only after the affected homeowner either paid the fine outright to avoid further hassle or successfully pushed back hard enough, as I was now attempting, to get it dismissed. I want to tell you about one of those cases specifically, because it revealed something that mattered enormously for understanding the broader scope of this problem. A homeowner named Bartholomew Okonkwo Delacroix had faced a similar citation 8 months earlier, following emergency removal of a diseased, structurally failing tree that his own arborist had flagged as an active fall hazard threatening a neighboring property. Bartholomew, rather than fighting the citation, had simply paid the $200 fine, telling me, once I reached out, that he'd assumed at the time the HOA must have some legitimate basis for the citation that he simply didn't fully understand, an assumption I recognized immediately, since it was nearly identical to what I might have concluded myself had I not happened to know the relevant ordinance language so precisely through my own professional background. I want to introduce you to the specific detail that turned this from a pattern of enforcement carelessness into something Rosalind felt warranted more serious formal action. When she requested, as part of building my own case, the HOA's complete citation records related to power equipment noise violations over the preceding 2 years, the records revealed that every single citation issued under this specific noise provision, without exception, had originated from Priscilla personally, rather than through any independent complaint process or objective monitoring system, meaning she alone had been personally responsible for identifying, documenting, and issuing every one of these citations, including the 4 we'd now identified that had disregarded the same clearly established hazardous tree exemption. "This is worth understanding more carefully," Rosalind told me, once she'd reviewed the full citation history. A board president personally patrolling for noise violations and issuing citations without apparent awareness of, or regard for, an exemption clearly written into both the county ordinance and your own community's declaration, 4 separate times over 2 years, suggests either a genuinely remarkable and persistent failure to understand the actual rules she's supposed to be enforcing, or a deliberate pattern of citing residents regardless of legitimate exemptions, betting that most people would simply pay rather than push back hard enough to expose the pattern. Rosalind filed a formal written challenge to my own citation, citing the specific ordinance exemption language, my professional licensing documentation, and the insurance company's own hazard assessment supporting the urgency of the removal, along with a broader letter to the full board requesting a formal review of all 4 identified citations, given the clear, documented pattern of the same exemption being consistently disregarded. I want to walk you through the board meeting that followed, because it was, by most accounts from residents who attended, considerably more contentious than the typical routine HOA gathering, given how directly the pattern of improper citations reflected on Priscilla's own personal judgment and enforcement practices rather than any broader, more diffuse governance issue. Rosalind presented the ordinance language, my own citation's clear factual match to the established exemption, and the 3 additional prior cases, laying out the pattern methodically for the full board and the residents in attendance. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond, attempted initially to argue that she had exercised reasonable discretion in each case based on her own assessment of whether the underlying tree work genuinely qualified as an emergency hazard rather than routine maintenance, an explanation that a board member seated beside her, a man named Desmond Ferreira Whitfield, who had remained largely quiet throughout Priscilla's tenure, responded to directly by asking whether the declaration granted the board president any personal discretionary authority to override an exemption, explicitly incorporated by reference into the community's own governing rules. I want to sit with that question for a moment, because it cut directly to the heart of the actual legal problem with Priscilla's enforcement pattern. Our declaration didn't grant her discretion to decide, case by case, whether a properly licensed arborist documented hazard removal qualified for an exemption that the ordinance itself defined in clear, objective terms: licensed professional, documented hazard, hazard mitigation purpose. The exemption either applied based on those objective facts, or it didn't, and in all 4 identified cases, including my own, it clearly did. Priscilla did not have a satisfying answer to Desmond's question, and the vote that followed authorized immediate dismissal of my own citation, formal refunds for the 3 prior improperly issued citations including Bartholomew's, and notably, a formal policy change removing Priscilla's unilateral personal authority to issue noise violation citations at all going forward, requiring instead that any future citation under this specific provision be reviewed and co-signed by at least 1 additional board member, specifically, to confirm the alleged violation didn't fall under any applicable ordinance exemption before being issued. I want to tell you about the broader community reaction once this pattern became known, because several residents who had never personally faced a citation under this provision nonetheless expressed real frustration at learning how casually established legal exemptions had apparently been disregarded. A frustration that, combined with what I understand, were several other unrelated grievances residents had been quietly accumulating against Priscilla's broader enforcement style, contributed to her declining to seek re-election when her term concluded a few months later. I want to tell you about the oak limb itself, because I did eventually finish that removal, obviously, completing the job later that same afternoon once the citation dispute, at least in its most urgent immediate form, had been set aside enough that I could focus on the actual hazardous work at hand. Work that, I want to note, was completed safely and without incident well before that afternoon's forecast wind system arrived. Exactly the kind of prompt hazard mitigation the exemption I'd cited existed specifically to protect. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Rosalind said to me during one of our early conversations. Reviewing the ordinance exemption language, alongside Priscilla's confident, dismissive response for what felt like the third time. She said that people who enforce rules without fully understanding the broader legal framework, those rules actually operate within, often develop a kind of confident carelessness precisely because most people they cite simply don't have the specific professional or legal knowledge to recognize when an exemption clearly applies. A gap in most residents' understanding that allows exactly this kind of pattern to persist quietly for years. Right up until someone with the right specific expertise happens to be the one standing at the receiving end of the citation. We had that expertise. And it turns out that one clearly written county ordinance exemption, one professional arborist's license that made the underlying facts impossible to genuinely dispute, and three other homeowners willing to come forward, once they understood their own prior citations, had never been legitimate either. Were more than enough to make sure Priscilla Wentworth Ashcombe never again got to cite a licensed hazard removal, as though it were nothing more than routine landscaping noise she simply didn't want to hear before noon. Thumbnail text. She didn't know the exemption, exist.